The only now I have to say no, I don't regret it. What I regretted is that it was ugly to me and the people found it out. Tina Turner would later say that the music business never just asked for talent. It asked for a toll. And according to long-circulating rumors, spiritual beliefs and hushed testimonies within that world, that toll was sometimes taken from the children. Not on a public altar. Not in some filmed ceremony. But through loss, silence, addiction, and devastation. In this case, we examine 7 women in music whose daughters and children suffered catastrophic fates, deaths, overdoses, disappearances, and lifelong damage. Events that some insiders quietly described as sacrifices traded for power, protection, or a career that would not fall. Was it truly a direct pact with something dark, or a belief system so powerful it shaped choices that slowly destroyed families? Tina Turner never presented evidence. What she talked about was fear of a force larger than contracts, larger than sales charts, larger even than motherhood itself. And once you start tracing the patterns, one question refuses to go away. Were these girls truly cursed or abandoned inside a system that demanded everything? Chapter 1. Whitney Houston, the Mother, the Curse, the Repeat. 1993-2015. The first name Tina Turner reportedly pointed to was Whitney Houston. Not because Whitney was fragile, but because her tragedy was the clearest example. Tina used to say that if you really wanted to see the price of fame, you had to stop looking at the star and start looking at the children. And no story haunted insiders more than this one. Whitney was a global icon, shielded by money, influence, and a public image wrapped in faith. So why did her only daughter end up walking almost the exact same road? Addiction, isolation, and a death scene so disturbingly similar, it stunned the world. For many behind the scenes, this was not random. It was the loudest warning sign of all. The question Tina believed people were too frightened to ask was brutal in its simplicity. How does the daughter of one of the most famous women on the planet die, as if the same bill is being collected twice? Whitney Houston stepped into motherhood at the peak of her power. And according to many who observed closely, this was also the beginning of a long unraveling that her daughter would one day echo. On March 4, 1993, Whitney gave birth to Bobby Christina Brown. To the outside world, it looked like a fairy tale chapter added to a legendary life: Grammy nights, red carpets, and a beautiful family. But behind the scenes, people in gospel and soul circles sensed something else settling in, something off balance that would only grow heavier with time. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Whitney's marriage to Bobby Brown grew increasingly poisonous. Police reports, interviews, and Whitney's own later words described a cycle of violence, emotional chaos, and deepening drug abuse. Fame shielded her image, but it also locked her inside it. Bobby Christina grew up surrounded by wealth and fame, yes, but also by addiction, instability, and adults too wounded to fully protect a child. In church basements and among longtime soul veterans, the whispers started early. This family is cursed, not as a medical diagnosis, but as a spiritual explanation for a life spinning out of control. As the years went on, those whispers got louder. Whitney's addiction worsened. Tours fell apart. Comebacks stumbled. According to people close to the family, Bobby Christina shifted from being simply a daughter to a witness, watching her mother fall under pressures she could neither understand nor escape. This is where the most disturbing rumor entered record: that Whitney, consciously or unconsciously, had paid a price for fame that her child would ultimately carry. Not through a ritual knife or a literal altar, but through neglect born from chaos, what some described as a spiritual sacrifice by omission. On February 11, 2012, the story reached its first breaking point. Whitney Houston was found dead in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. The official report listed accidental drowning with heart disease and cocaine use as contributing factors. The world went into mourning. Tributes filled the airwaves. But among gospel elders and soul insiders, grief mixed with a familiar dread. Many quietly insisted the pattern was not finished. The curse doesn't stop with the mother, some warned. 3 years later, fear became reality. On January 31, 2015, Bobbi Kristina Brown, just 21 years old, was discovered unconscious in a bathtub, in an image that echoed her mother's final moments, so closely it electrified the entire industry. The city was different. The details were not identical. But the tableau, a young woman in a bathtub unresponsive, was similar enough to feel like a replay. After months, in a medically induced coma, Bobbi Kristina died on July 26, 2015. For many observers, coincidence no longer felt like a satisfying explanation. In spiritual and gospel communities, the language around Whitney Houston's rise turned hard and unforgiving. What had once been called tragedy was now described as repetition, not random loss, but a pattern, not misfortune, but a debt coming due in stages. According to long-standing rumors, Whitney's meteoric ascent in the mid-1980s was viewed by some as too fast, too complete, too flawless, to come without unseen consequences. The most controversial idea centered on a so-called contract, not a piece of paper, but a spiritual agreement whispered about in church back rooms and among veteran musicians. The rumor said that Whitney, under brutal pressure to deliver a career-defining hit and lock in her place in history, was surrounded by advisors who believed in symbolic covenants. Prayers fused with ritual language. Success framed not as something simply earned, but something that had to be claimed, sealed, and guarded. There is no documented proof. No ritual was ever recorded. Believers, however, pointed to the way Whitney sometimes spoke in interviews, her talk of destiny calling in forces larger than herself, as proof that she felt bound to something she could not control. Some took that idea even further. They claimed Whitney showed signs associated with secret spiritual orders, not robes or public ceremonies, but symbols and behaviors that were later reinterpreted as marks, particular hand gestures during performances, recurring imagery in stage designs, lyrics that emphasized surrender, possession, or inevitability. In hindsight, believers read these as coded acknowledgments, not to Satan by name, but to what they called a dark authority. Again, there is no hard evidence, only grief overlaying interpretation. Within this belief system, Bobbi Kristina was never viewed as deliberately sacrificed. Instead, she was seen as collateral, the unintended cost of a bargain Whitney herself may never have fully grasped. Raised inside addiction, isolation, and non-stop exposure to excess, Bobbi Kristina grew up without the protection that fame pretends to offer. According to this interpretation, Whitney did not give her daughter away. She lost her slowly to the same forces that demanded her voice, her body, and finally her peace of mind. Those who use the language of sacrifice in Whitney's story often redefine the word. They are not talking about blood rituals. They are talking about exchange, fame instead of stability, legacy instead of protection, immortality instead of a secure bloodline. In that reading, Bobbi Kristina's death becomes the final payment, a repetition so exact it unsettled even skeptics. Whitney could not shield her, believers argue, because Whitney herself was trapped. Trapped in addiction, trapped under expectation, trapped inside an identity built on a flawless image that no human being could maintain. Whether one calls it a curse, a contract, or a catastrophic system failure, the conclusion inside those circles is the same: something was taken that could never be restored. There is no written confession, no signed document, no verifiable ritual, only belief and the chilling symmetry of a mother and daughter dying the same way, as if the ending had been scripted long before either of them understood the price. The idea of a family curse survives not because it explains the medical fact, but because it explains the emotional reality that people watched unfold: a cycle of addiction, a mirrored death, a daughter who followed her mother, not only in love and devotion, but into the same final scene. For those who believe in spiritual cause and effect, the conclusion feels inescapable. Something was taken. Something had to be repaid. Whitney Houston never publicly claimed to have sacrificed her child. She never admitted to any pact with the darkness. What remains is a pattern so precise that it continues to disturb anyone who looks too closely. And for many, that pattern alone is enough to believe that fame once obtained doesn't always loosen its grip. Sometimes it stretches forward and reaches for the next generation. Tina Turner Children Raised Inside Darkness, 1958–1978. After the tragedy of Whitney Houston and her daughter Tina Turner, admitted that the story did not end there. With visible heaviness, she acknowledged that her own life belonged on that same list. Tina did not speak as a judge. She spoke as someone who barely escaped. She said that, before she could recognize the pattern in other women, she had to confront it in her own home first. Her children did not lose their lives, but they lost something else just as permanent: their childhood. They were raised inside fear, violence, and a kind of emotional darkness that no child should ever be trained to accept as normal. Tina called it another kind of death, the kind that doesn't show up in headlines, but carves scars all the same. That realization, she said, was what finally broke her. Because once you see your own children listed among the casualties of your success, you stop asking who is guilty and start asking why this machine keeps taking from the innocent. The first scream Tina Turner learned to endure did not rise from a cheering audience. It rose from inside her own walls. Long before the world knew her as a symbol of power and survival, she was already a young mother trapped inside a relationship that many insiders later described as dark, controlling, and spiritually poisoned. According to people who lived close to that story, motherhood did not shield Tina from violence. It tied her tighter to it. Between 1958 and 1960, Tina became pregnant and then married Ike Turner, a man whose musical brilliance was matched by many accounts only by his cruelty. What followed from 1960 through 1976 was not just a troubled marriage. It was a closed system of domination. Tina would later confirm years of physical beatings, sexual violations, and psychological control. But what is often erased from the public narrative is the way this environment soaked into her children's lives. They grew up backstage, in hotel corridors, in studio lounges, in houses where tension never fully went to sleep. People close to the Turner circle have said that violence was not hidden from them. It was simply part of the air. Screams through thin walls, bruised faces, sudden disappearances. Ike's rages could explode without warning, and Tina's fear never really left the room. In later interviews, Tina described this era as a spiritual prison language that would fuel decades of dark speculation inside soul and rock communities. Those rumors grew sharper during the early to mid-1960s, when Ike Turner's influence in rhythm and blues circles was near its peak. According to longtime musicians, who claimed they worked sessions around 1962, 1966, Ike was feared not just for his temper, but for what some believed he thought he knew about power. The talk never surfaced publicly. It stayed in dressing rooms, tour buses, and smoky studio lounges where the lights were low and words traveled farther than proof. Several session players later recalled Ike talking about success as something that had to be held, claimed, or defended, not earned, defended. Insiders alleged that he rejected the idea that talent alone could keep a man on top, insisting that momentum needed to be guarded from invisible threats. Again, there is no documented evidence of ritual activity, no recordings, no photographs. Only stories that drifted from musician to musician. But even the language made people uneasy. In 1964, one guitarist reportedly walked away from work near Ike after hearing him talk about rivals being cut off by forces they could not see. By 1966, 1968, as the Ike and Tina Turner Review exploded worldwide, the whispers intensified. Crew members later described Ike's obsessive control over private spaces, hotel rooms, rearranged lights, left burning all-night objects placed and replaced with strange precision. Some dismissed these habits as paranoia. Others quietly interpreted them as protective rites. The specific spiritual terms were not used in those days, but years later, members of the diaspora would reach back and apply their own language to what they believed Ike was trying to do, ward off loss. By 1969, when the revue reached new commercial heights, another rumor circulated among touring musicians that Ike believed fame attracted envy, and envy attracted harm. According to these accounts, he spoke of closing doors spiritually before shows. What that meant in detail was never clearly explained. No ritual was ever openly described. But belief alone was enough to shift behavior. Players became cautious. Some stopped making direct eye contact. Others avoided personal conversations altogether. The fear turned intimate in the early 1970s. Tina's injuries and disappearances grew harder to hide. Friends later claimed that Ike framed misfortune as consequence. Success, he suggested, required payment, and instability was simply part of that cost. In that telling, violence and control were not just personal failures. They were tools, distorted strategies to maintain dominance in a world Ike believed was governed by unseen struggles. Crucially, none of this has been proven. No former associate has brought forward concrete evidence of occult ceremonies. No memoir has documented specific rites behind closed doors. What does exist is a culture of belief powerful enough to shape silence and compliance. Musicians who feared Ike did not need proof. They needed distance. By 1976, when Tina finally fled with little more than her name, insiders said the atmosphere shifted. The aura of fear dissipated. The rumors began to thin, not because they had been disproven, but because the source they orbited was gone. Years later, when Tina described those years as a spiritual prison, believers retrofitted that phrase with darker meaning. They insisted the darkness was never about spells, but about control maintained through fear, and the idea that power flowed from a place no one could openly confront. Once again, there are no rituals on record, no firm facts beyond memories and testimony. But in an industry where belief routinely shapes behavior, even a rumor can harden into reality. And for many, that rumor defined the cost of standing too close to Ike Turner's power at its peak. Some insiders later claimed that Tina came to believe the success of the Ike and Tina Turner revue carried a spiritual price that seeped into her family. In that framework, the children were never deliberately targeted. They were collateral. Their pain was interpreted as the cost of surviving inside a machine that demanded submission, secrecy, and endurance. This is where the word sacrifice enters her story, not as blood spilled on an altar, but as years of endurance without escape. Tina stayed. The children stayed. The violence continued. To those who later retold this period in spiritual terms, the children paid with their innocence, so the star could remain standing. By the time Tina broke free in 1976, the damage was already settled into their lives. The children lived through it, but survival was the only victory. Childhood itself was gone. Tina would later suggest that something evil had fed on that season of her life, though she did not label it Satan and never claimed a direct pact. What she did repeat was that there was darkness there, heavy, suffocating darkness, and it took years of spiritual rebuilding to climb out of it. To the believers, Tina's children were not sacrificed on an altar. They were raised inside one. Aretha Franklin children born into silence, 1955–1957. Aretha Franklin's children entered life under a rule that was never written down but ruthlessly enforced: do not speak. Before she became the Queen of Soul before the awards, the civil rights anthems, and the shimmering gowns, Aretha was a child herself, forced into motherhood, in secrecy, in shame, and under absolute control. On January 28, 1955, Aretha Franklin gave birth to her first son at just 12 years old. On August 31, 1957, she gave birth again at 14. These dates are part of the official record. What came afterward, however, was not protection. It was erasure. The identities of the fathers were never publicly named. The pregnancies were hidden from the outside world. The births were folded away beneath layers of religious power and family authority. Aretha's father, Reverend C. Franklin, was one of the most influential voices in the black church. Historians and biographers have said his reach over media community and narrative was nearly total. Journalists were turned away. Questions were cut off. Inside gospel circles the message was blunt. This must never be discussed. Within those same faith communities, another darker interpretation began to circulate. Aretha's early pregnancies were framed by some as a spiritual stain that had to be buried for her gift to rise unchallenged. Gospel elders, according to later accounts, spoke of it not as a wound to be healed, but as a sin to be hidden, buried, not redeemed. Her children grew up largely outside the glare of her early fame. They did not stand center stage with their mother. They were almost never part of the public storyline. According to people who later reflected on that period, Aretha was not permitted to be openly maternal in those years. The carefully shaped image, holy voice, consecrated destiny, pure vessel, had to be guarded at any cost. And once again, the cost was paid by the children's visibility. This is where, for believers, the language of sacrifice becomes impossible to ignore. Not because they think Aretha chose this outcome, but because the system surrounding her demanded it. The children existed, but not openly. They were breathing, but in shadow. In spiritual terms, some describe them as living offering souls kept in the dark so that the chosen voice could stand clean in the light. There is no proof that Aretha herself believed in satanic pacts or dark covenants. What does exist in abundance is testimony that shame, fear of divine punishment, and religious terror shaped her early years. In that atmosphere, silence became a survival tactic. Motherhood turned into something to conceal, not celebrate. To those who frame her story through a darker spiritual lens, Aretha's children were not sacrificed through death. They were sacrificed through denial of acknowledgement, denial of presence, denial of a mother who could claim them without consequence. And in a belief system where silence is treated as a shield of power, that denial becomes the offering. The children are made invisible so the chosen narrative can stand untouched. Chapter 4. Florence Ballard. When Motherhood Ended, a Career, 1966-1976. Florence Ballard was the voice that never got to grow old. Before she became a whispered warning in Motown corridors, she was the emotional center of the Supremes, the rawest, most powerful voice in the trio. Then, almost without warning, she went from essential to expendable. The breaking point came in 1967. That year, Motown officially removed Florence Ballard from the Supremes. Publicly, the story was polished attitude issues, instability, unprofessional behavior. Behind the curtain, insiders told a colder version. Florence was struggling financially, emotionally, physically, and according to long-running rumors inside Motown, motherhood was quietly labeled incompatible with the image they were selling. Between 1968 and 1970, Florence gave birth to children while living on the edge of poverty. This was not just a decline in fame. It was a collapse. Friends later described a woman who went from headlining global tours to worrying about basic bills, about food on the table. The same industry that had once leaned on her voice now treated her as dead weight. Inside Motown circles, a cruel tag reportedly followed her: bad energy. That phrase meant more than gossip. It was a warning label. Former Motown associates have claimed that female artists were explicitly discouraged from getting pregnant while under contract. Pregnancy meant unpredictability, vulnerability, and a loss of control. Florence's pregnancies in this telling were not just personal choices. They were interpreted as proof that she could no longer be managed. In a system built on obedience and fantasy, having a child could be treated like a breach of contract. This is where the idea of sacrifice creeps in, not as a ritual performed in secret, but as punishment enforced in plain sight. Florence chose to be a mother. The system chose to erase her. By the early 1970, her mental health had deteriorated. Depression pressed down. Alcohol became a way to numb the edges. According to those who were close to her, Florence came to believe that motherhood had destroyed her value as an entertainer. Whether that belief was objectively true or not, it was devastatingly real to her. The calls never came to bring her back. There was no triumphant reunion, no late redemption arc to restore what had been taken. On February 22, 1976, Florence Ballard died at just 32 years old. The official cause was heart disease complicated by alcohol. She died poor, mostly forgotten by the same machine that had once showcased her voice on some of the most famous records in the world. For those who read her life through a darker lens, Florence's story became a warning etched into Motown history. If you choose motherhood over the image, you will be punished. If you refuse or are unable to sacrifice your children to the myth being sold, the system will sacrifice your career instead. Among soul insiders, Florence took on symbolic weight. She was the woman who could not or would not sacrifice her children for a polished fantasy, and according to those who still whisper her name, the price for that decision was everything. Tammy Terrell, the child that never reached the microphone, 1966, 1970. Tammy Terrell's smile hid a pain the world never heard her fully sing about. In 1966, she and Marvin Gaye became one of soul music's most beloved duos. Their duets felt almost sacred, intimate, tender, alive with a chemistry many believed was real. Night after night they performed love songs that sounded less like performances and more like confessions. Then came October 14, 1967. That night, on a Virginia stage, Tammy collapsed mid-performance. Marvin caught her as she crumpled into his arms. The show stopped. The fantasy shattered. Doctors would later diagnose her with a brain tumor. Over the next 2 years, she endured surgeries, treatment, and a long, painful decline. She was still in her early 20s. Inside the industry, another story surfaced, never printed, never confirmed, but never quite disappearing. According to persistent whispers among musicians and Motown staff, Tammy Terrell may have been pregnant shortly before her health collapsed. No public medical record confirms this. No official biography states it plainly. Yet the rumor has survived for decades because of one detail that continues to bother those who investigate the absence of detail. Tammy's medical history, as it appears in public summaries, rarely touches her reproductive health. The progression of her illness is described in broad strokes. Dates blur. Choices go unexplained. To believers in the darker version of events, that silence is not an accident. They argue that a pregnancy, real or even suspected, would have been catastrophic for Motown's carefully crafted image at the height of her success with Marvin Gaye. In their interpretation, Tammy's body became a battlefield between truth and branding. From 1968 to 1970, her condition worsened. Marvin, according to later accounts, was crushed by guilt and grief, saying he was never the same after her death. Those who subscribe to the sacrifice narrative say Tammy represented something the system did not know how to protect: youth, vulnerability, and the possibility of motherhood that could shatter a profitable illusion. On March 16, 1970, Tammy Terrell died at just 24 years old. No child was ever acknowledged. No pregnancy was ever documented. For skeptics, that is where the conversation ends. For believers, that is exactly where it begins. They argue that Tammy's story fits too neatly into a pattern. Women whose bodies became inconvenient to the machine were erased, silenced, or left to fade away without rescue. In that telling, Tammy's sacrifice was not a child who lived, but a child who never got the chance to exist. And to those who look for meaning in what is missing, that absence is the loudest sound of all. Chapter 6. Chaka Khan, Children Paying the Price, 1970s 2010s. The first warning, people say, did not come from a doctor. It came from the child. Inside the industry, whispers followed Chaka Khan's rise. Her fame was blazing upward, but something in her private life was quietly cracking, and the cost would not fall on her alone. Through the 1970s, Chaka's ascent was electric. As the voice of Rufus, and then a solo powerhouse, she seemed to be everywhere, on tour, in studios, under spotlights that rarely dimmed. What looked like glamour from the outside, inside, is described as survival through numbness. By Chaka's own later admission, cocaine addiction became a constant companion. During this turbulent climb, Chaka became a mother. Her son, often identified as Damian Holland, was born with cerebral palsy and autism, facts Chaka has acknowledged publicly. The medical reality is straightforward. The spiritual interpretation is where rumor begins. Within soul and funk circles, some framed Damian's condition as a reflection of a life lived under relentless pressure addiction and spiritual imbalance. Not a divine punishment, they said, but a debt passed down. As the 1980s and 1990s unfolded, Chaka's struggles deepened. There were drug-related arrests, rehab stays cancelled, and resurrected tours. Friends described a woman fighting to stand upright while the ground beneath her shifted constantly. Damian, meanwhile, grew up in a world where love existed alongside chaos. To believers in the darker narrative, this is where the idea of children bearing the cost takes root, not as a single act, but as a long, grinding consequence. Children absorbing the fallout of a life their parents never really had time to stabilize. The story twisted further in 2011. That year, Chaka's family was shaken by a kidnapping incident involving her sister Yvette Stevens, who was taken by Chaka's then-husband and later released. The incident horrified the public and scarred the family. For insiders who already believed a shadow followed Chaka's success, this was confirmation danger did not just appear around her career. It walked into her home. In gospel-adjacent and spiritual communities, the language hardened. Some talked about generational debt burdens moving quietly through bloodlines. Others rejected that idea, arguing that addiction, stress, and systemic neglect were enough to explain everything. Even among skeptics, one fact was hard to ignore: the superstar survived in the spotlight while her child carried lifelong challenges from birth. This is why the sacrifice theory refuses to fade. Not because anyone claims Chaka wanted harm, but because her child seemed to carry a cost he never chose. In that reading, the industry's demands and the self-destruction they encouraged became an invisible altar. Damian's life, marked by disability and vulnerability, was cited by believers as proof that children often inherit the damage of battles their parents fought just to stay on stage. Chaka herself has pushed against mystical explanations, focusing instead on recovery, responsibility, and care. But the rumors linger precisely because the pain is undeniable. When a star survives and the child suffers, people start looking for meaning in places medicine cannot fully reach. For some, that meaning is spiritual. For others, it is social. Either way, the conclusion lands in the same place: the child paid a price fame never covered. Chapter 7. Marvin Gaye and Anna Gordy, Children in a War Zone, 1970 s. 1980 s. If there is such a thing as sacrifice in this story, it begins not in a studio or sanctuary, but in a house. A family home where fear became routine and children learned to listen for danger instead of lullabies. Marvin Gaye's marriage to Anna Gordy, sister of Motown founder Berry Gordy, set their family at the center of one of Motown's most charged power webs. By the 1970s, Marvin's genius was fused to his demons. Cocaine addiction, paranoia, and escalating conflict dominated his life. Anna, once his grounding force, became both partner and opponent in a relationship that mixed passion with violence. Their home, by many accounts, became a battleground. Police reports and court documents record domestic disputes. Friends remembered nights full of shouting, slammed doors, shattered objects, and a quiet, heavy fear. The children who moved through those rooms, biological and stepchildren, absorbed that instability as normal. To believers in the darker interpretation, this is where the idea of children being sacrificed becomes painfully literal, not through ritual death, but through a slow surrender of safety. Childhood traded for survival in a house that never let anyone truly rest. Through the late 1970s, Marvin's finances imploded. Lawsuits piled up. Tax debts grew. The family fractured under pressure. His relationship with Anna turned bitter and legalistic, with custody and money twisted together in a knot that kept tightening. Children were present for arguments that no child should be near. According to people close to the family, safety became unpredictable. Adults were unstable. The only strategy that made sense for a child was to grow quiet, watchful, and small. By the early 1980s, Marvin slipped further into isolation. His paranoia sharpened. He spoke of being watched, hunted, targeted. Inside that house, children learned to move through silence, reading every shift in mood, disappearing when voices rose. In spiritual retellings, this era is described as children living inside a curse, not because anyone lit candles around them, but because violence had become the weather in their home. The story's cruelest twist came on April 1, 1984, when Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., in the family home. The world was stunned. For those who had grown up within that house, the horror confirmed what they had always sensed: the danger was never entirely outside. The children lost more than a father. They lost the chance for their past to ever feel safe in memory. Believers in the sacrifice narrative argue that the children of Marvin and Anna paid with their sense of security, their innocence, their trust in the people meant to protect them. Fame magnified every conflict. Money sharpened every wound. Power locked everyone into roles they no longer knew how to escape. In that telling, the offering was not a single life on an altar, but an entire childhood spent in a war that no child started. Skeptics insist that addiction, untreated mental illness, and generational trauma explain everything, and they may be right. But the rumor persists because the pattern persists. When brilliance collides with power and substances, it is almost always the children who stand closest to the blast. In the end, Marvin Gaye left behind immortal music and a family marked by trauma that no song could erase. Whether one calls it a curse, a sacrifice, or a failure of protection, the result is the same. The children grew up inside a war zone that the world called a home. Near the end of her life, Tina Turner stopped talking about chart positions and trophies. She talked about prices. She said that fame did not just ask for talent. It demanded silence. It demanded endurance. And sometimes it demanded the lives, physical, emotional, or spiritual, of the people closest to you. Tina never claimed she watched robed rituals. She never stood on a stage and named Satan as the architect. What she warned about was something even harder to fight: a system so powerful that it convinces artists suffering is normal, that children will somehow be fine, that survival is worth any cost as long as the spotlight stays on. Looking back at Whitney, Tina, Aretha, Florence, Tammy, Chaka, Marvin, and Anna, she believed the pattern was impossible to ignore. The stars lived. The children paid. Not because their mothers and fathers were monsters, but because the machine they served rewarded obedience and punished humanity. So the question Tina left behind still burns. If fame requires you to lose your children physically, emotionally, or spiritually, who are you really making a deal with? If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments.